Hello, it's Loxton, and I know that this topic is commonly done. It's all over the internet, people are talking about it all over the place. So this video is a combination of me giving my thoughts and theories on the matter, as well as going through and debunking some of the other theories, the more common fan theories that are all around. With evidence though, not just using my brain, using evidence and such. It's gonna be cool. Ever since Nintendo first revealed snippets of information about The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, speculation and theorizing has indeed run rampant, and among these debates is the question of where the game will land on the timeline. This has been paramount for some people. There are plenty of events in the Legend of Zelda timeline that deserve some further exposition, like the Era of Chaos, the Imprisoning War, and the Interlopers, to name a few. Not to mention the entire history of Lorule. Whether or not Breath of the Wild is going to build on these sorts of events remains to be seen, and there is always the possibility that this game is something completely new, even so far as to be outside the current timeline as we know it. Speculation has even extended to the possibility of a reunified timeline, where the three timelines are collapsed into one due to the events of the Great Calamity that is created by Calamity Ganon. Though, while splitting timelines is relatively easy, given that you have access to a magical temple that can take you to 2 points in time, putting them back together is far more complicated. And the last thing the timeline needs is more complexity. With every new trailer released, gameplay released, and every new cutscene footage, things start to piece together, revealing small nuggets of what the plot might be. And from what we've seen of the events, characters, and locations, it may already be possible to see where this game will fall into the Legend of Zelda timeline. So first, boom! Spoilers for all kinds of Zelda games all over the place, and potential spoilers for Breath of the Wild, I suppose? This is 100% speculation. But hey, if the speculation happens to be right, then spoilers. That's super unlikely though. But it's all fun. Fun and games. With the seemingly sparsely populated Hyrule, enemies that took their appearance from Skyward Sword, and the crests and statues of the goddess Hylia rather than the royal family of Hyrule, and scenes of Zelda wearing her white dress, there was some speculation of whether or not Breath of the Wild took place very early in the timeline. Maybe even directly after the Hylians of Skyloft returned to the surface. It seems like a decent theory at first, however it has been officially disproven. In an interview with Game Informer, Shigeru Miyamoto and Eiji Aonuma were asked if the game takes place before or after Ocarina of Time, and Aonuma says after. So I guess that's out. But that only cuts away about a fourth of the games. Next up we have the adult timeline. This is the timeline that takes place in the future of what was the adult era of Ocarina of Time. With Link returned to his childhood by a regretful Zelda and Ganon believed to be defeated, the world returned to normal. Some time passed, and Hyrule Castle was rebuilt, supposedly over the site of the Temple of Time, so that the Master Sword and access to the Sacred Realm would be guarded from that point onwards, in the new, most defensible location in the whole of Hyrule. Things seemed to be going well, until Ganon returned, bursting free from his captivity in what the game describes as a red rage. However, with Link sent back to the past, there was no hero to face the power of Ganon, and as such, Hyrule fell. King Daphnis Nohanasin Hyrule entrusted Hyrule to the gods, who sealed it and sank it below the waters of the Great Sea. A few hundred years later, the events of Wind Waker take place. When Wind Waker reaches its climax, Ganondorf collects the pieces of the Triforce and is about to wish Hyrule back to the surface under his control. But this is prevented by King Daphnis Nohanasin Hyrule touching the Triforce and wishing Hyrule to be completely washed away, and everything is completely destroyed, crushed and wiped out of existence under the weight of the falling floodwaters. With Link and Zelda returned to the Great Sea, they set off in search of a new landmass and eventually come upon a continent, and upon that land, they founded New Hyrule. From the trailers we have seen, there are plenty of references, and what some might call evidence, to support that Breath of the Wild will take place in this timeline. However, following them through leads to contradictions, and one massive flaw in this theory, making it impossible. Nonetheless, let's take a brief look. The first and most obvious clue has been in our faces the entire time, though no one seems to be talking about it. The mysterious flowers that appear in the title for Breath of the Wild. This flower has white petals that fade to blue at the center. The plants often appear to have two flowers, though some are only a bud. This is also the exact or very close description to the flowers in Wind Waker, or so some say, because there is one significant difference, and that is the shape of the stem. In Breath of the Wild, the flower is on a thin stem, while the sea flower is on a thick, gourd-like base. Admittedly though, this could be simply a byproduct of the different environments. Now then, the main piece of evidence that people all over the internet are bringing up in favor of the adult timeline placement theory is the inclusion of the Koroks. The Koroks are the descendants of the Kokiri who shed the humanoid form for the ability to fly using the Deku or Korok leaves that they carry with them. Using this power, they were able to escape with the Deku Sprout to a mountaintop as instructed by the goddesses to escape the encroaching floodwaters. On that mountaintop, the Forest Haven was established, and each year the Deku Sprout, now the Great Deku Tree, sends out his children, the Koroks, to plant trees all around the islands of the Great Sea, in hopes of reclaiming the sunken Hyrule. Not entirely sure how that works, but the Great Deku Tree clearly knows something I don't, so I'm not going to argue. However, it's only in the adult timeline that the Koroks have ever been previously encountered. Considering that, it certainly supports the theory that the game takes place in the adult timeline. However, this isn't really evidence at all. The Koroks are simply another form of Kokiri who use that particular forest spirit form when faced with a calamity. The floodwaters. It's a calamity. You see what I'm saying? Calamity Ganon. Ah, big danger. Let's turn into this form so we can be safe. As all timelines derive from Ocarina of Time, and we know that the Kokiri aren't entirely wiped out in Ocarina of Time, then every subsequent timeline from that game has the possibility of having Kokiri and or Koroks. Just because we've only encountered them in Wind Waker to date doesn't mean that it's the only timeline in which they exist. They simply weren't important to the story of the other Zeldas. And plus, there is actually a reference to them in the Downfall timeline in the form of this painting of Makar's mask, in A Link Between Worlds, and Triforce Heroes. Back to Wind Waker, we are told the history of Hyrule and the placement of these events in the adult timeline through the Scroll of the Hero of Time. This chronicles the disappearance of Link, and Ganon re-emerging. As I mentioned before, Ganon is described as returning in a red rage, and his appearance in the Scroll of the Hero of Time depicts Ganon as a huge, monstrous beast, larger than Hyrule Castle, and is surrounded in black clouds or smoke. This may suggest that Breath of the Wild takes place before the events of Wind Waker. However, as the same scroll says, the people waited anxiously for the hero of legends to reappear, but in the end, the hero who had traveled the flow of time and left the country behind did not appear. There was categorically no link to face the Ganon that forced the gods to sink Hyrule. As such, the events of Breath of the Wild do not match the events previous to the events of Wind Waker. So, back to after. How about after? During the various playable demos of Breath of the Wild, people were able to discover an ingredient for cooking called rock salt, with the flavor text reading, crystallized salt from the ancient sea, commonly used to season meals. Some have suggested that this salt came from the receded Great Sea of Wind Waker. As I said previously, the Koroks were attempting to raise Hyrule from the depths by planting trees. Maybe they succeeded? Nope, afraid not. Remember, Hyrule at the end of Wind Waker is utterly destroyed by the power of the Triforce, literally wiping it off of the map with no trace. Even if they were able to raise the land, none of the structures would be left standing, and yet, while in ruins, the Temple of Time is still present, and looking a lot younger than a few thousand years of underwater wear that it would have received before being raised. So what about the salt? Well, there is another ancient sea, the ancient sea of Nayru. Long before the Nayru province was a desert, it was a sea, as we are told in Skyward Sword. The sea eventually dried up, leaving rock salt deposits everywhere. And just because the rock salt in the demo was discovered in the Great Plateau doesn't mean that's where we'll find it in the full game, or that the Great Plateau is the origin of that particular lump of rock salt. People move things around, especially things as important as salt. There are a number of minor points of note, such as the Sheikah shrines and the Guardians having an appearance like brain coral, varieties of which can in fact bioluminesce in blues and greens, suggesting that the shrines were located at the bottom of the Great Sea and possibly explaining the Sheikah's disappearance during Wind Waker. And the most recent connection to Wind Waker has been the reveal of Beetle. While Beetle has appeared in both Skyward Sword and the Minish Cap, the only games he has appeared in after the timeline split has been in the adult timeline. However, both of these points are moot when you consider that the game cannot fit comfortably into the adult timeline without some serious rewrites. While rewrites are a possibility, if we have to resort to changing established canon just to fit the theory in, then it's not much of a theory. In conclusion, it seems very unlikely that Breath of the Wild takes place in the adult timeline. Next up is the child timeline. After victory in the adult era, Link is sent back to warn a young Zelda of Ganondorf's evil plans. She tells her father, the king, who inexplicably believes his 10-year-old daughter and her orphan wild child friend who lives in the woods, and he turns away Ganon. Being turned away, Ganondorf decides to take the kingdom by force, and mounts a full-scale war on Hyrule, raising an army from among his people, the Gerudo. This is what fans and theorists have called the Gerudo-Hylian War. According to the backstory of Twilight Princess, the war against Ganondorf went on for many years, and it was Ganondorf's brutal savagery and dark magic that gave him the upper hand for so long. An upper hand which allowed him to capture and destroy Hyrule Castle and Castletown, which forced the Knights of Hyrule to move their fortifications north, to where the new Hyrule Castle now stands. The Hero of Time, now a child again, goes on his own mission to find Navi, winding up in Termina for the events of Majora's Mask, but sometime returns later. Link grows up and fights for Hyrule, even becoming something of an important knight, but it doesn't distinguish himself as the caliber of hero that he was when he fought Ganon alone, and eventually he dies in battle. Regretful, he returns in the future as the Hero's Shade, to pass on his knowledge to his descendants, the Link from Twilight Princess. Ganon is eventually caught and sentenced to be executed, but with the Triforce of Power he survives the execution, and kills one of the sages before being exiled to the Twilight Realm. The connections to the child timeline in Breath of the Wild aren't particularly numerous, however, they are significant. Starting with the focal point of the entire game, Hyrule Castle containing the sealed Calamity Ganon. There is no doubt that the castle at the center of Breath of the Wild's landscape is the same castle in Twilight Princess, the Northern Hyrule Castle. The towers, the spires, what are those things, bridges? They all match up precisely to the architecture of Twilight Princess's Hyrule Castle. One way we can tell for sure, if this was that particular castle, then we would also see the same Castle Town, right? In a cutscene shown in a number of trailers, we see that Castle Town is seemingly under attack from corrupted guardians. And then again, 100 years later, when Link awakens, we see the ruined version, covered in Ganon's malice, the pink and black goo that appears to be causing the corruption. The castle and the town gives us a strong indication that Breath of the Wild could be in the child timeline, and because we see this castle town destroyed, it also helps us place its precise position in the timeline, that being after Twilight Princess, which just so happens to be the Zelda game released right before this one, Twilight Princess HD. Though, while a lot of the general shapes are the same, the circular courtyard and the fountain, the large archway leading to the castle, etc., the details are different. The roofs are a different color, the flags are slightly different, the fountain bears the goddess Hylia's crest and not the royal crest. That's a big weird thing that totally changes everything. While I suppose it's possible that the details could have been changed after the events of Twilight Princess and then destroyed, it seems more likely that the town was destroyed and rebuilt with new features. The most telling of which is the new mural found in Castletown in Twilight Princess HD, which seems to depict the Gorons, the Zora, and the Rito, among others, presumably coming together. Could these murals be depicting some events from Breath of the Wild? If so, then these murals would have to have been carved after Breath of the Wild, putting it right before Twilight Princess. And between the two games, the slight differences in the castles were made. When we first start up Breath of the Wild, the first major location we encounter is the Temple of Time, and below it are the last remnants of the ruins of Old Castletown from Ocarina of Time. A sad sight for sure. Looking at the location of the Temple of Time compared to the location of Hyrule Castle on the map, it seems to match up perfectly with the placement in Twilight Princess. And once again, the temple can help confirm the placement in the timeline. Comparing the Temple of Time from Twilight Princess to the one in Breath of the Wild, the Temple of Time from Twilight Princess is much older and considerably more dilapidated. In Twilight Princess, the walls of the temple are barely standing, and at some point between the two instances, it seems like the ground beneath the Temple of Time has given away, causing it to partially sink. In Breath of the Wild, we see the Temple of Time on the edge of a hill, overlooking some trees that are encroaching on the temple, whereas in Twilight Princess, it has entirely been consumed by Faron Woods. With all that considered, it seems more than likely that Breath of the Wild could take place right before Twilight Princess on the timeline. But before putting this area to rest, let's see if it's at all even possible for Breath of the Wild to take place after Twilight Princess. According to the Hyrule Historia, after Ganondorf was defeated in Twilight Princess, Link put the Master Sword back in the Temple of Time in Faron Woods, and returned to the simple life of Ordon Village. Some several hundred years after Ganondorf's defeat begins the events of Four Sword Adventures, in which the bitterness that the Hylians felt toward the Gerudo for their actions in the Gerudo-Hylian War was all but gone, and so the Gerudo returned to Hyrule. During this time, it appears that there was no reincarnated Ganondorf, no darkness, or a great calamity, but instead an era of peace. The Historia says, "The world received the blessings of the gods once more, and the land was covered in light." So Breath of the Wild is possibly in this timeline, but if it were, it would have to be right here, before Twilight Princess. The Downfall timeline is a what-if scenario that is created by the question, what if Link was defeated by Ganondorf in the final battle of the Adult Era in Ocarina of Time? This is going to be a long one, so let's get through the backstory quickly. With Link dead, A Link to the Past explains that Ganondorf then gained access to the Sacred Realm again, and finally seizes the completed Triforce, becoming Ganon, and filling the Sacred Realm with his corruption. The corruption of Ganon called out to the greed in the hearts of men, and when they entered the Dark World, they were turned into monsters and demons. And so Ganon's armies grew, and he continues to wage war across the threshold of two worlds, against the Knights of Hyrule. In order to stop Ganon, the King of Hyrule ordered the sages and Zelda to seal the Sacred Realm forever, trapping Ganon inside, realizing that they should have done something other than sending a 17-year-old boy to take on the master of all evil in the world. Some hundreds of years later, a wizard from the desert named Aghanim sought to break open the seal to release Ganon into Hyrule again, by forcing the descendants of the sages through the closed portal into the Dark World, each one breaking the seal of their ancestor. Zelda called out to Link, who rescued her initially, but during his search for the Master Sword, she too was captured, and the seal was finally broken. Link seeks out and defeats Ganon in the Dark World, claiming the completed Triforce for himself, and returning the Dark World to the Sacred Realm, and freeing everyone within it. Following the events of A Link to the Past, the Triforce was hidden away in a palace created especially for it within Hyrule. But the Triforce was restless and it calls out to Link again, sending him to various locations to rescue the oracles of Din and Nayru, and prevent Koumei and Kotake from resurrecting Ganon. That same Link, after saving them, then sets sail for more adventures and discovers new lands, where, after a storm, he finds himself washed up on the shore of Koholint Island, the resting place of the legendary Windfish. It's not known what happens to Link after the Windfish wakes up, only that Link continued to seek further adventures. After this, there was a time where the royal family of Hyrule used the Triforce to bring prosperity to the land. But one king believed that after his death, the Triforce would be misused by his son, and so hid it away. Then in a rage, he lashed out at his sister Zelda, who knew the Triforce's location, and had a wizard cast a spell on her, putting her into a deep sleep. Realizing his mistake, he took her to the northern palace of Greater Hyrule, and there she remained, the Zelda of legend. Generations passed, and for a time, there was no one who could wield the Triforce of Courage, until Ganon appeared again, and a new Link was born. Not only could this Link wield the Triforce, but he would go on to defeat Ganon and awaken the Zelda of legend. Hoo boy. The connections to the Downfall timeline in Breath of the Wild are less rooted in special items or man-made locations, but instead in themes, conventions, and natural landmarks. Given that the world of Hyrule is allowed to evolve naturally, there is no reason that a lot of the elements that link Breath of the Wild to the Downfall timeline couldn't occur in any other timeline, though there are some exceptions. When the very first teaser trailer was shown off at E3 2014, Aonuma stated that the themes for this new Zelda game would be revisiting past conventions. What we see in Breath of the Wild is a return to the beginning, and drawing on elements from the original Legend of Zelda, and by extension, the Downfall timeline, where the earliest Zelda games all take place. In that teaser, we were told that the world would be open to us, and the first sight we saw was Link fighting a Guardian, that we later would be told were replacing Octoroks. Little did many realize at the time, but it was the second time we saw those events in the same trailer. These clips from the original Legend of Zelda were also shown, depicting something very similar, planting the seed of connections to the Downfall timeline. The next big hint was at the Game Awards 2014, where Shigeru Miyamoto and Eiji Aonuma showed off some gameplay of Breath of the Wild, then just called Zelda Wii U. The sequence starts out with Miyamoto pointing out that it was sunset, and that they were facing west. A seemingly throwaway comment, as Aonuma guided Link to a cliff overhang, where we saw a recreation of an artwork from the original Legend of Zelda. Again, not solid proof or anything, but it's building on that seed. Then, jumping ahead to 2016, we have had a load of trailers, each revealing more and more connections to The Legend of Zelda, through its locations and mechanics, the open exploration of the world, the blue, stronger monsters, and specific locations such as Spectacle Rock, the Cleft Mountain as seen in the artwork of the original Legend of Zelda, and the cliffside overhanging Hyrule as you exit the Shrine of Resurrection. Again, so far, none of this is individually evidence that the game takes place in the Downfall timeline, but it's building a pretty solid case that we should be paying more attention to the classic games, The Legend of Zelda, Zelda 2, and A Link to the Past. And that's exactly what Breath of the Wild is. It's a link to the past of the Zelda games. Thematically, Breath of the Wild is the same as A Link to the Past. In the distant past, a corrupting force in the form of Calamity Ganon appears in Hyrule. The hero is defeated in battle, and so the sages are forced to seal Ganon instead. Now, 100 years later, Link is awoken by the voice of Zelda calling out to him within Hyrule Castle, because the seal is about to break. The same exact opening and backstory as A Link to the Past. The big piece of evidence, though, was the reveal of the ruined Master Sword, rusted, found in a worn and weathered stone platform, with white flowers either side, and even more notably, not in the Temple of Time where it has been found in every single game in which the Master Sword has appeared, save for two. A Link to the Past and A Link Between Worlds, where the Master Sword is located in the sacred grove of the Lost Woods. The very images that the trailer holds on, with the sun rays shining through the canopy onto the Master Sword. This is yet another recreation of a classic artwork made for A Link to the Past. So, like the Child timeline, we have a lot of connections to the Downfall timeline, except this time, it may prove a little harder to pinpoint the exact location in the timeline, as the references prove to be a bit more scattered. Seeing as a lot of the themes focus around A Link to the Past and the original Legend of Zelda, we may as well start there. Before the Legend of Zelda and the Downfall timeline, there are two eras worth noting: the Golden Era of prosperity, followed by an era of decline. The Master Edition collection of Zelda Breath of the Wild hides some interesting lore in plain sight, in the form of Sheikah text in the back of the map. Some very, very dedicated fans managed to translate this into Japanese, and then into English. The beginning of this Sheikah text reads, "Hylian's past stories of a destined time long past, where multiple races lived and worked together in harmony. The Sheikah tribe's blue aura breathed through the land, and this mutual prosperity continued, until a cataclysmic disaster struck." When you first encounter the old man, who is totally not the king of Hyrule, he refers to Hyrule being in a state of decline, stating in reference to the Temple of Time, "Ever since the decline of the kingdom 100 years ago, it has sat abandoned in a state of decay." So there was an era of prosperity, a golden era, followed by an era of decline. And here, in this world which has remarkable similarities to the map of the original Legend of Zelda, makes this appear to be an almost cut-and-dry case. But then what about the Twilight Princess landmarks and locations? The Downfall and Child timeline directly following Ocarina of Time are remarkably similar in the events that take place, to the extent that the only real difference seems to be that in the Downfall timeline, Ganondorf's attack on Hyrule was a surprise. In both timelines, Ganondorf invaded Hyrule and successfully pushed back the Knights of Hyrule to the north, away from Ocarina of Time's castle town. The war still raged on for many years, and Link still dies. In both timelines, Ganondorf is only stopped by being sealed away rather than killed. In the Downfall timeline and the Sacred Realm, and the Child timeline, the Twilight Realm. With that in mind, the similar events likely spurred the people of Hyrule and the royal family to take similar actions, specifically abandoning Castletown to create a new fortification and settlement to the north. As such, Twilight Princess can be used as a general guide for the progression of Hyrule in the Downfall timeline too. So, the similarities to Twilight Princess still make sense in the Downfall timeline. Plus, this even better explains the differences in detail. And one of those differences may turn out to be the Lost Woods being northwest of the map like in A Link to the Past, rather than the southeast like Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess. Yes, we have a theory for that too. We actually have two. The Legend of Zelda timeline isn't something all fans expect. While there has always been a clear continuity written into most of the games, the idea of a solid timeline turns a lot of people off. And for a long time, there have even been people pushing for the idea of a reunification of the timelines. Some event that could allow the timelines to be reunited as a single continuity. However, splitting timelines is a lot easier than combining them together, as a combined timeline would require all historical aspects of all the various timelines to be interwoven. And with the events of Wind Waker, that could get complicated. The first version of the reunification theory that I heard was about that of a cataclysm across all timelines, supposedly the Calamity Ganon, that collapses all worlds together into one. And surprisingly, it's not as far-fetched as you might think, though this particular one does require Hyrule warriors, which admittedly is non-canon, but remember, Just because it never happened historically doesn't mean it doesn't hold certain design choices that could influence future titles. In Hyrule Warriors prior to the events of the game, there was a particularly powerful Ganon, who, in order to prevent his return, not only did they kill him, but they split his soul into 4 pieces and scattered them throughout time and space. One shard was sent to the sealed ground in the Skyward Sword era. Another piece was hidden at the Palace of Twilight in the Child timeline prior to the events of Twilight Princess. Another was sent to the Ocarina of Time Water Temple in the Adult timeline, and the final piece was guarded by the Master Sword in Hyrule Warriors continuity. When the shards of Ganon's soul are reunited, they emit a reddish-purple energy and black smoke, before uniting and becoming Ganondorf. Furthermore, all of Ganon's attacks in Hyrule Warriors emit the same black smoke and colored energy, which ranged from a deep orange to red to purple. Finally, when he is victorious, Ganondorf stands proud, with a smaller, more humanoid-looking Calamity Ganon looming over him. With Ganon's soul shards scattered throughout multiple points in the timeline, does it seem plausible that were his will and power strong enough that his soul could pull those moments in time together as one, combining the whole new universe and forging the Calamity Ganon? The interesting thing is, Breath of the Wild includes elements from these particular eras. The Hylian royal crest is replaced in most instances with the crest of Hylia and statues of Hylia, as depicted in Skyward Sword. The castle and Castletown in Breath of the Wild is the castle and Castletown from Twilight Princess, and Wolf Link can be summoned using the Wolf Link amiibo. The Water Temple is certainly from the Adult era because Ruto is an adult and the Hero of Time has already left, meaning that we're in a period of time before Ganon returns, when there was no Link to stop him, as we already covered. That Ganon, remember, is similar in concept to Calamity Ganon. While this seems to fit surprisingly well, in fact, Aonuma indeed has stated that Hyrule Warriors is not canon. Also, so far there has been no indication of actual continuity from Hyrule Warriors in the mix of Breath of the Wild, so make of this theory as you will. However, another YouTuber, HMK, recently posted a video explaining his take on the unified timeline theory. You can watch his video here, but here's the TLDR version. Following the events of The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, Zelda is about to send Link back to the past, so that he can regain his childhood. But before she does, Link stops her, telling her that he wants to stay. What's done is done. He becomes her personal bodyguard, confident, and maybe more. Suddenly, there's no timeline split at all. The story has taken a straight progression, and everything we've seen from the 3 other timelines can occur in some form or the other into this new timeline. With some obvious differences, of course. Remember, the whole Downfall timeline is a what-if universe. So, this is another what-if universe. As I mentioned before, in Wind Waker, Ganon is said to return in a red rage, and the depiction of him in the Scroll of the Hero of Time shows him as a gigantic monstrous beast, surrounded in black smoke, the Calamity Ganon. Except this time, since Zelda didn't send Link back, there is now a Link to fight this Ganon. And while not being at the bottom of an ocean is preferable, Link still isn't strong enough to defeat Ganon. So, the Sheikah come out of hiding and use their technology to try and defend Hyrule, only to have it be corrupted by Ganon's magic, and then turned against them. Basically, Breath of the Wild becomes Wind Waker's replacement, at least until much later. Rather than flooding all of Hyrule, the events of Breath of the Wild take place. And following this, Twilight Princess takes place, as it would. It is a very interesting theory for sure, but I'm not sure. The only criticism I can give this theory is a minor one. At first I thought, but what about Hyrule Castle? If this takes place after the Adult era and Link doesn't look much older than 17 in Breath of the Wild, maybe 19 at most, how did they build a whole new Hyrule Castle and Castletown in the space of just 2 years? Because remember, the Twilight Princess Castle and Castletown is different, and further north. And that's the castle we see depicted in Breath of the Wild. You can't build that much that fast. Though I guess they do have magic and stuff, so maybe? Well, the simple answer is, they didn't. We know from Twilight Princess that during the wars with Ganondorf in the Child timeline, that the forces of Hyrule were forced north, and that is where they established the new Hyrule Castle, taller and prouder than ever before, a symbol of being close to the goddesses, and a beacon of hope for the people who were scattered and displaced. And this all happened when they knew Ganondorf was coming for them. In a surprise attack, they may have had no choice but to flee from the start, and where would they go? Ganondorf is marching up from the south, so they flee north. and continue to wage their war with Ganondorf on a battlefront beyond Ganondorf's tower that we never see in Ocarina of Time. This new base of operations could be an old stronghold that the Knights of Hyrule rally at during the 7 years of Link's slumber in the Temple of Time. And during these 7 years, plus the 2 others, they build up the new Hyrule Castle and Castle Town. But, you know, there's still holes. Lastly, I want to bring up the theory that this game is actually a total reboot. Drawing on so many references from other games scattered throughout the entire timeline, it seems far more plausible that this game could be a reboot, a clean break from what has come before, a fresh start, an all-new Zelda. While I suppose it could be argued that if the unified timeline theory is true, then it is in some aspects a soft reboot, starting things from zero after Ocarina of Time, while an argument could be made that even in a total reboot, pivotal events such as Ocarina of Time could still be canon, but it's admittedly unlikely that this will be a reboot. It's been hilarious going through all the research for this project with Andy, a Zelda expert who helped me out with this tremendously. Whenever we thought we had a solid theory, a new trailer screenshot or snippet of information comes out with the tiniest of details that completely table flips the whole thing. As such, Andy has given up and decided to wait and see. I, on the other hand, think we may be looking into this a bit too much. Sometimes, the simplest answer, with the least amount of digging, is the right one. It's probably just 100 years after Ocarina of Time, and this is the same Link from Ocarina of Time after being killed by Ganon in the Downfall timeline. After Link's defeat, Zelda runs off with Link and puts him in the Resurrection Chamber, which takes 100 years to revive Link. Hence the Deku Tree asking Link if he recognized him, saying it's been 100 years.
That look on your face tells me that you have no recollection of me, however.
Hence Full Power Calamity Ganon having some similar attributes to the Ocarina of Time Ganon, so on and so forth. It would also explain why the Sheikah are so prevalent. Also, as far as the business side of things go, you have this game being a look back at the classics, like the original Zelda, which plays on nostalgia. But this game would also be a direct sequel to Ocarina of Time, the Zelda often considered to be the best one. Good marketing. But either way, I'm sure we're all going to enjoy the game anyway. Remember, these are just theories. Possible scenarios that we've pieced together from the relatively tiny amount of information that we've been given through trailers and limited gameplay. And if some of the smallest details in what has so far been revealed have been enough to completely overturn some of the theories we've had, then I dare say the rest of the game will likely do the same. But what do you think? I've given you like 6, or I lost count, possibilities. Some more likely than others. But again, what do you think? Let me know down below. And until next time, make sure to always use that noggin.